Ryuga Gotoku Studio has written many amazing characters, perhaps even too many of them. When you look at the fanbase's adoration that can extend to anyone from a cool protagonist to the most random NPCs, balancing your old cast with any newcomers becomes a nightmare to plan around. Because of this, we've seen many fan-favorite characters be written out of the series to allow for new stories to be told. So I thought we could shine a light on some of these old characters today. But let's set some ground rules. Number 1. No canonically deceased characters will be included. Number 2. The criteria behind the list that will follow is a combination of character relevance, unresolved plot points, and personal preference. Number 3. This video will feature spoilers for several games, so if you see the name of a game you haven't beaten preceding the character reveal, run for cover. Also, this is by no means a complete list, so share your own picks in the comments below. Now that that's settled, let's begin with entry number 10. To start the list off, we have the only known chairwoman of the Tojo clan, Dojima Yayoi. Shindo, get back in your casket. Yayoi was initially introduced through a sub-story in the first game, being the widow of Dojima Sohei, and she immediately made a unique impression. While scorned lovers aren't a rarity in this series, something about her demeanor carried more weight and dignity than we've seen from many side characters here. In fact, it is arguably this demeanor that made her briefly take the reins of the Tojo and command the utmost respect from legends like Kiryu and Kashiwagi. The reason why she is on this list is that we have no idea what happened to her after the events of Yakuza 2. The wiki says that she simply retired after Daigo became the 6th chairman, and that is it. Truth be told, she didn't have that much screen time across the first 2 games, and most of the community nowadays only remembers her for the Shindo associated memes. But there's more to this character than just being the mom of a future chairman. When you take into account the atrocities committed by Dojima Sohei across the series, it speaks volumes that you have a character still be loyal to and honoring his memory, even leaving flowers in remembrance well after his passing. Here we have someone stricken with grief, who nevertheless refrains from blindly taking revenge, even when all the evidence pointed towards Kiryu being Sohei's assailant. This makes her almost motherly concern towards Kiryu at the start of Yakuza 2 all the more meaningful. Having said that, her absence is felt significantly less than that of the other characters on this list, as her goals were mostly fulfilled by the end of the second game. Now, let's take a look at entry number 9. Hayashi Hiroshi, our first rival from the Omi Alliance. He's been a boss in both Yakuza 1 and 2, and was shown to be a highly ambitious, but generally honorable member of the underworld. However, when people list off memorable rivals for Kiryu in the series, you'll obviously find characters like Nishiki and Ryuji on every single one, but will rarely find even a passing mention of Hayashi. Don't get me wrong, there's a night and day difference between their respective roles in the plot and general screen time, but you can clearly tell that the writers were onto something with the change in Hayashi's portrayal between Yakuza 1 and 2. While his first fight wasn't all that memorable, the sheer brutality of his fight in Yakuza 2 made me intrigued by his potential as an underdog for the other games. But unless you count his demonic downfall in Yakuza Dead Souls, this character has just been cast aside in lieu of other characters with resounding grudges. Now, you might ask, okay, but this is just one boss, why should he of all people come back? Need I remind you that a character with even less screen time and relevance has returned through the Hitman missions in Yakuza 3? Yep, someone like Arase made his way back into the series through this side mode, and had a pretty solid justification for it. So it's a shame that someone like Hayashi wasn't given the same courtesy. I could easily see him switching allegiance with every passing game just to finally best Kiryu in a fight, because that's essentially what we've seen in his first 2 appearances. He was first a member of the Omi Alliance, and when that fell through, he joined the Jingun Mafia for a new shot at glory. He throws away any and all allegiances to pursue his end goals, and that is something rather admirable for a mere side boss. Hell, I could even see him pledging allegiance to the Amon clan and fighting Kiryu in every subsequent game. And for an underdog like him, it could have made Hayashi the quintessential recurring rival for the Kiryu saga, instead of the Amon reskins we got down the line. And if you need any further justification for his character's potential, I'd urge you to watch Devilion's video on Hayashi, as he perfectly nails his ethos. Ah, yes, the point in Yakuza 3 where everyone thought this series turned into a Mexican telenovela. The twin brother of Kiryu's father figure, Joji is a character whose importance in the game's story is often overlooked. We are so frequently told how cool Shintaro Kazama was back in his heyday, but haven't witnessed all that many of his triumphs ourselves. Having a character that in many ways mirrored his conviction and fighting prowess made for a great way to put many of those past grievances to rest. While Joji's appearance was a jarring twist at first, his inclusion helped reaffirm how far Kiryu has come over the first 3 games, both mentally and physically, while giving some tangential development for a legend of the Yakuza world. Now, we know that he has returned to the US upon finishing the investigation behind the Black Monday incident, and that should generally mean that his character arc has been concluded. This is something that I agree with, to an extent, but considering how old Joji was during the events of Yakuza 3, he should also be close to retirement. So I'm curious how a person as dedicated to an organization as he is would spend his days after leaving the CIA. Maybe he could drop by Okinawa and say hi to his adoptive family from time to time. Despite his obvious similarities to Shintaro, I believe that Joji was a compelling character in his own right, so it would be nice to know that he is doing alright at the very least. I'm sure Kiryu would appreciate it as well. Lo and behold, we have our first major boss on the list. Kido was evidently one of the 4 bosses that we fought at the end of Yakuza 4, and considering who he was up against, it's a wonder he managed to get out fairly unscathed. Now, the fact that someone who's technically a final boss actually survived the finale of his story is miraculous enough, but unlike someone like Arai for example, Kido also didn't go to prison, as he didn't commit any major crimes. Which begs the question, whatever happened to him? The deal with Kanemura Enterprises as a whole was that it had some noteworthy individuals with great strength who had the potential to be legends of the underworld. Obviously, this didn't work out for Arai, as he is still thought to be imprisoned during the events of Yakuza 7, which is a bit of a turning point for the Japanese underworld as a whole. But we never even had a mention of Kido, despite his general fighting prowess, which could have landed him the leading role in Kanemura after the events of Yakuza 4. The answer behind his exclusion, though, is rather simple, even if it isn't directly tied to the narrative of the franchise. The Yakuza series has a tendency to model certain characters after real-life actors, for example, the Dojima lieutenants in Yakuza 0, Tatsuya in Kurohyou 2, Yagami in Judgment, etc. And in the context of Kido, he was modeled after Kiritani Kenta. While we did have certain guest characters return for subsequent releases in the franchise, which is essentially everyone I've mentioned before Kido's actor, it's a shame that this character was just left off on a question mark of sorts. There was genuine potential here. But, as was stated in interviews with RGG Studio, they had trouble fleshing out the majority of Yakuza 4's story, and this seems to have carried over to Yakuza 5 as well. So, it's safe to assume that Kido's story will remain incomplete. Kaoru probably had the least ceremonious exit from the series to date. She has evolved into a genuine love interest for Kiryu in Yakuza 2, only to then be shipped off to the US to pursue a job in educating future police officers. This also gave birth to some rather disturbing memes in the community, courtesy of the mysterious character profiles that seem to have obtained sentience, and now just fill themselves out as you progress through Yakuza 3. I'm not going to question why we would know what Sayama was up to through this system, when she could have easily revealed this info herself through the countless messages she sent to Kiryu. But even with the info on this profile, we don't really get a conclusion to her story arc. We know that she was always career-oriented, hence why even her relationship to Kiryu wound up taking a backseat. so I don't see her settling down anytime soon. But there's even more to it than that. Putting aside the narrative choices, it was stated that Sayama's original voice actress was hard to work with, which arguably contributed to her taking a lesser role in Yakuza 3. But we've also seen the release of Kiwami 2 down the line, with a new actress at the helm. Before this, the writer have tried to stomp out any hint of a flame between Kiryu and Sayama by stating that he was only ever in love with Yumi. But the romantic implications behind Kaoru's involvement are merely one side of her character. Sure, if we're talking canon entries, she easily had the most chemistry with Kiryu. But when you consider her character arc in Yakuza 2, where she went from a person who only found meaning in her work, to someone comfortable enough to open up to people and enjoy herself, this shouldn't just be thrown away for the sake of an idealized version of Kiryu. Again, it's not always about romance. Both of them have gone through a lot. They deserve a meaningful conclusion to their life stories that has as much meaning as the events that led up to it, and not just a footnote in a menu. Aizawa Masato, the final boss of the most ambitious Yakuza game to date. I've mentioned how final bosses don't often survive the games that introduce them, but Aizawa just keeps tipping the scales in his favor. He even survived an off-screen death we've been led to believe in back during Kiryu's part of the story. And, much like Entry 7 on this list, there's a lot to unpack here. I feel that even the staunchest defenders of Aizawa's character have to agree that the portrayal of his convictions was fairly sloppy, compared to the usually high standards that RGG strives for. Again, the potential is there, and his boss fight speaks for itself. But if we're meant to believe that his drive to succeed is as sincere as he claims, then he needs a careful and genuine narrative redemption. And with the state of the underworld in Yakuza 7 and Lost Judgment, I think he has a fair shot at achieving it. In his own words, he trained in the shadows. He believes that the strongest should always win. We know that Aizawa was alive at the end of Yakuza 5, and there was no mention of him going to prison that I can recall. Imagine him appearing in Yakuza 8 with a new family of his own, trying to claw their way to the top from the wreckage of the Japanese underworld. Viewers of this channel know that I'm not a fan of Aizawa's character, but this is one of those instances where I genuinely believe RGG could achieve those narrative heights they aimed for back when they were working on Yakuza 5, but were unable to deliver on due to time constraints. But until that time comes, I guess we'll just have to wait for this particular fish to finally step out of the shadows he loves so much. I'm guessing this entry resulted in one of two reactions. Reaction 1 being utter confusion, and Reaction 2 being a waifu Mardi Gras. Allow me to offer some context. Kudosaki was a character who helped you prepare for the Dragon Heat underground matches during the events of Kurohyou 1. She was a martial artist around Tatsuya's age who wound up being mentored by his father, Taizan. She was there throughout the entirety of the first game, giving you advice on the fights, reprimanding your carelessness, and just having this playful back and forth with Tatsuya that was always entertaining. Now, here's the thing. For whatever reason, she is completely absent from Kurohyou 2, and this is probably the most confusing disappearance of a character that I've seen in this series. The story once again revolved around Dragon Heat, and with her involvement in the first game, you'd definitely expect her to be there. There were no voice actor controversies that I'd heard of either, and Tatsuya didn't suddenly get a quote-unquote love interest that would somehow lead to the exclusion of Saki's character. Now, there is a slight chance that this disappearance of hers was explained in some of the side content from either Kurohyou 1 or 2, as these games only ever received partial fan translations, but I've yet to find anything that would even remotely explain her absence. Hell, if it weren't for her actions towards the end of the first game, everyone on top of the Millennium Tower would have died. Coupling that with the slight tongue-in-cheek nature of her behavior and how well it worked with the rest of the cast, it's really sad how we never got to see her reaction to Tatsuya's return in the sequel or the fate of Dragon Heat hanging in the balance. She also had a strong admiration for Taizan, as he was basically a father figure to her, so I'm curious how she'd handle the aftermath of the first game's events. I know this sounds all over the place if you haven't played Kurohyou 1, but to dilute this down to its essence, It's kind of like seeing Date at Serena or Mari at Bartender. If you find yourself in such iconic places without the characters who are part of their identity, it just feels empty. But maybe that's just me. Anyway, let's move on to the top 3 of the list. I feel that this entry doesn't even need explaining. In fact, I've touched upon Tanimura's absence in another script for a future video already. So here's the Cliff Notes of the Cliff Notes version. Tanimura is a cop who gambled and took bribes from scummy employers so he could take care of the immigrants residing in Little Asia. After resolving the mystery behind his father's death and dismantling a police conspiracy, he started working alongside Date and became a model police officer. Anyone care to guess what happened to Tanimura's character? If you answered yet another voice actor controversy, you'd be correct. But the saddest thing about it is the fact that his old voice actor, Naremiya Hiroki, was wrongfully accused, but retired from the entertainment industry regardless. And much like the switch up behind Sayama's voice actress, Tanimura wound up being remodeled after a new talent, in this case, Masuda Toshiki, who did a fantastic job with the role. So once again, we have resolved arguably the biggest issue behind a character's exclusion, but have to contend with several games mocking their absence and trying to push them under the rug. But Tanimura's absence is arguably felt the strongest. From Takayuki Yagami being dubbed as a spiritual successor to Tanimura by some fans, to Tanimura's general combat style having strong similarities to Snake in Lost Judgment, to the events in Yakuza 6, which were related to Little Asia, there are so many instances where even a passing mention of Tanimura or the other residents of Little Asia relocating someplace else could help resolve a gigantic plot hole that's been here for nearly a decade. Even with the admitted pacing issues of Yakuza 4, I feel that Tanimura's characterization was phenomenal, especially if you look into his sub-stories, like the one with Russian Roulette. He's a phenomenal character that could help out tremendously in the current Yakuza climate. Hell, if we managed to put Date and New Serena back into Yakuza 7, despite it being Ichiban's story, I don't see why we couldn't do the same thing with Tanimura in Judgment. But again, this is just my personal take on it. Now, who do we have in spot number 2? My dear viewers, we are in the presence of royalty. The one and only Shinada Tatsuya. Again, his inclusion should be self-explanatory, as the only piece of criticism I've ever found against Shinada was his gameplay, and that's a subject worth a whole separate video. But story-wise, he arguably had one of the strongest character arcs out of any character, and it all happened in the span of one game that was originally supposed to be all about Kiryu. The older I get, the more painful it becomes to see everything that Shinada had to go through, which makes the fact that his ending was rather inconclusive all the more saddening. Now, I know that there will be people who will say his story arc was concluded, and he went back to Nagoya to live with his neighbors happily ever after. Yeah, the same neighbors who tried to kill him a while back. Look, with the exception of Takasugi, the place Shinada wound up returning to is horrible, at least if we're talking about the people inhabiting Kinecho specifically. Let's also remember how Shinada initially declined Daigo's monetary reward that would help him start over, and instead gave it all to Takasugi to clear his debt and then some. And while this speaks volumes about Shinada's character, this puts him back to square one. No money, a bunch of fake people hounding him, and unless Takasugi offered him a job of offering loans, I don't see how this is the happy ending that he really deserved. The man has been through hell and is still one of the nicest characters in the series. Again, I have my grievances with Yakuza 5, but Shinada's character was one of the highest highs it achieved, intentionally or not, and he deserves a proper send-off. But this brings up another question. If we didn't write another character profile that said Shinada went to the United States or something, then how would we even include him in the future games? After all, most of the districts in Yakuza 5 have appeared exclusively in Yakuza 5. Well, you'd be surprised to know that Nagoya, or Kinecho to be exact, isn't that far away. Hell, according to this site, the air distance between Tokyo and Nagoya is shorter than the one from Tokyo to Osaka. And yet, Sotenbori was the second most frequently used district in the franchise, even appearing in Yakuza 7. Honestly, if all we get in the future is a sub-story saying how Shinada is doing alright for himself, that'll be good enough for me. Plus, I get the feeling that he and Ichiban would become really good friends immediately. Now, that's all fine and dandy, I think that's the phrase, but if someone as amazing as Shinada wound up getting the number 2 spot, then who is at the top? I'll tell you right now that there are certain characters whose exclusion from the list will be explained after the number 1 spot, but if we're being completely honest, when it comes to the topic of this very video, there is only one character who should be on the proverbial throne. Behold, the legendary Mad Dragon of Kamurocho. Considering how this is the number 1 character, I'll now do the introductions I should have made during entry number 4 on the list. Kurohyou are 2 Japan-exclusive, PSP-exclusive games that were co-developed by RGG Studio and Sin Sophia. The protagonist of these games is a former delinquent named Ukiyo Tatsuya. Now, let's have a look at some of his accomplishments. He became an undefeated legend of the underground fighting circuit at the age of 17, mastered a total of 28 different fighting styles by the time he was 19. At that same age, he toppled a government regime that nearly erased Kamurocho as a whole. He was offered a career as a professional boxer, which he turned down due to philosophy. And arguably his greatest accomplishment ever, he actually returned from the United States. Some characters should really learn from him. Within just the first game, Tatsuya arguably had the strongest character arc out of any character in the franchise, protagonist or otherwise, going from a violent delinquent who fought everyone who disagreed with him and eventually became a beaming ray of hope for the underworld of Kamurocho as a whole. This is the most condensed version of his character that I could offer without going on a 40-minute long exposition. But if there was one flaw that I would have to point out in his characterization, it would be the fact that we don't see a conclusion to his story after Kurohyou 2. The ending of the first game was conclusive enough, but with how the second game ended, all we know is that he will forge his own path in life. But again, just like with Shinada, how will he make a living? Will he go back to pro boxing? I mean, his old agent said he wouldn't give up on him. Will he go back to Dragon Heat to be a trainer like his dad? And considering the events of Yakuza 7, which I often pointed towards during this video, does Dragon Heat even exist anymore? There are so many questions, and in the middle of them all is a character with the most potential out of anyone that was seemingly forgotten by Ryuga Gotoku Studio, as Tatsuya is still only 19 years old. But I know that there will inevitably be people in the comments who will claim that this is not a Yakuza game. So allow me to point out the following. Both of the games have Ryuga Gotoku in their names. Nagoshi directed and wrote the story for them as well. The games were featured and discussed as part of the 15th anniversary livestream from RGG themselves. The games had a number of RGG members who worked on them, including Shoji Hidenori, who still contributes to Yakuza OSTs. And lastly, as soon as you boot up Kurohyou 2, you'll notice the old logo that RGG Studio used being prominently featured, with this being the second game to ever feature it. And in case you were wondering, the first game where it was used was Binary Domain, just a month before, a game that wasn't discussed during the aforementioned anniversary stream, so I hope this clears things up. With all of that out of the way, I know some people will ask about characters like Akiyama being absent from the list, which is a fair point. But beyond the fact that this series simply has far too many amazing characters that would fit the pre-established criteria, the reason why Akiyama and even Hana were missing from this list is the context behind the making of Yakuza 7. Apparently, Akiyama was originally going to be featured in the game, but his voice actor had other contractual obligations and thus couldn't contribute to it. More importantly, he is a well-known fan favorite, and considering how Yakuza 8 will also feature Kiryu as a protagonist, I'd wager a guess that many cool characters that were absent for a while could come back, like Akiyama, Hana, Yuya, Kazuki, and many others. Beyond that, any characters from Yakuza 0 and 7 were generally absent from this list, for obvious reasons, and I really hope I won't need to make an updated version of the video that is just filled with the cast of Yakuza 7. But at the very least, even if these characters are gone from the mainline entries, at least we can rejoice in the existence of RGG Online. So, there you have it. If you want to see any other videos from me in the future, leave your thoughts in the comments. And thank you if you made it this far through the video. Special thanks to the loyal supporters of the channel who make me go the extra mile with these discussions. You're amazing. Until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers!